Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. This is a segment that I call Responding to the Critics, and this is video number 27 in my review and response to the book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled "Why Not Full Preterism?" Now, as I have mentioned earlier, this book is and can be considered Steve Gregg's attempt to answer many of the things that he did not answer in our 2013 formal public debate held in Denver, Colorado. That debate was sponsored by my friend Mike Zeman. In this book, again, Why Not Full Preterism? I think I called it Why Not 80-70 the other day. Anyway, Steve mentions me by name 140 plus times. So it's very clearly an attempt to answer me specifically, and thus, by answering me, ostensibly, to address covenant eschatology. Now, in what can really, in many ways, a person could make the argument that last week's video is absolutely foundational. It's a crux interpretum. That is, Steve's view that the Christian home is not heaven. It is the hope, says Gregg, that when we die, okay, we go to heaven, and it's okay, but it's not a real hope. Now, you think about this, and you go, okay, let's say that a Christian dies, and they go to heaven, and they spend 1,000,000 years. But Steve Gregg's, that's not good enough. Not near good enough. What will happen, he tells us, is that after that 1,000,000th year, whenever that might be, might be 10 million years. But of course, Steve would say it might also be next week. But again, the point of it is, being in heaven with the Father, with the Son, with the Holy Spirit is not good enough. We have to be physically raised from the dead. In other words, we have to leave heaven, come back to earth to get a body that we didn't need to be in heaven, that we didn't need to be in fellowship with God. So we come back to earth, and we live on earth for eternity. Because according to Steve Gregg, the promise of the new heaven and the new earth is a promise of a literal, physical new heaven and new earth, not heaven. So please make sure you go back and watch last week's video. So that's fundamental to Steve Gregg's eschatology. It is his eschatology in many ways. And yet he talks a great deal in the book about how important the rapture is. Well, what is the rapture? Well, according to Steve's view of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it's when Christ comes back at the end of time and takes the church off of the earth, takes them to heaven. So the rapture really is in no way a part of the hope of the Christian in Steve's view of the rapture. We're not really looking for that. We're looking for what lies way beyond that, and who knows how long. So again, that was part of last week, because that rapture is to take the Christian to heaven, again, in Steve's view, to wait. It's the interim place. Heaven is the interim place. You see, it's not Hades anymore. Do you understand that? It's not Hades, a place of waiting for the reward. No. You might be in Abraham's bosom, but Abraham's bosom is not good enough. You leave Abraham's bosom, which is a place of rest, a place ostensibly of reward, a place of fellowship with Abraham and all the worthies. But again, it's not good enough. So we leave that place of waiting to go to another place of waiting, which is heaven. Okay. So then we come to what I will call the real crux interpretum of Steve Gregg's entire paradigm. Listen, Steve's insistence on a physical resurrection at the so-called end of time, Steve's entire paradigm revolves around and is to a great extent built upon what we're going to discuss today, and that is the death of Adam. Steve tells us, and this is on page 152 and following, and I'm going to read from page 153 momentarily. But Steve Gregg believes that the only death of the garden, the only death mentioned, and thus if it's the only death mentioned as a curse, okay, as a condemnation, and as a penalty for sin, please follow this, okay? First of all, Steve depreciates the reality, denigrates the idea of sin death, of covenant death. He does that very clearly on, pages 149 and following, mentioning me, mentioning Ed Stevens as teaching sin death. But it's real clear that Steve Gregg says the only death of the garden that was imposed as a penalty for sin was physical death. Page 153. Even though there is no reference, you got to catch this, folks. Even though there is no reference in the story of Adam and Eve to any kind of death other than physical, parentheses, from death you are, to the dust you shall return, Genesis 3:19. Preston's argument is based upon the wording of the threat that God made to Adam. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die, Genesis 2:17. The argument goes like this. We know that Adam did not die physically on the day he sinned, so the threat must refer to a spiritual, non-physical death. This is far, Steve says, this is far from the only explanation of the passage available, and assumes as a primary meaning a doctrine that is not mentioned in the Genesis account at all. From this point, the argument assumes that the death which resulted from the curse and from which Christ redeems us in resurrection is not physical, hence no physical resurrection, but spiritual and covenantal. While the non-physicality of the resurrection may sound, catch this, may sound like a logical conclusion from such an original premise, that is, that the penalty of Adam was not physical death, the premise itself is flawed. We'll see. After Adam sinned, God specifically announced that his penalty was physical death and decomposition, and made no mention of any other kind of death. So how did we deal with, in the day that you eat, you will surely die? Okay, now, first of all, let me recommend to you that you go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, eschatology.org, okay? Take your pick. But on donkpreston.com, in the search bar, search for The Death of the Garden by Dr. Dallas Burdett. Dr. Burdett has taught Hebrew as well as Greek on the college level. Okay? Extremely well read and conversant. And by the way, I had his article confirmed by a friend of mine in Israel who is a world-class Hebrew scholar. And this world-class Hebrew scholar said, quote, Dr. Burdett certainly knows his Hebrew. Okay? So you have Dr. Burdett examining and explaining, diving deep into the Hebrew of, in the day that you eat, you will surely die. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that he does not agree with Steve Gregg even a little bit. Not even a little bit. Now, please go and read that article for yourself. So Steve says This language, in the day that you eat, you will surely die, can be explained in a couple of different ways. Point number one, the phrase, in the day you eat, you will surely die, can be easily understood as an idiom parallel to that used by Solomon. I've been told lately, Don, just talk conversationally. Doesn't help. Okay. Don't strain your voice. Look, folks, I get excited when I talk about the Word of God. I really do. And, the volume just naturally kind of turns up. But as you can tell, I'm struggling right now with my voice again. And I don't know why. I guess maybe I've overused it. This week alone, I've really, really been doing a lot of filming for filming ahead and what have you. And so, as you can tell, my voice is somewhat strained. Well, anyway, back to Steve. Steve says, the phrase, in the day you eat, you will surely die, can easily be understood as an idiom parallel to that used by Solomon to Shimei, who was, by the way, an enemy of David. Quote, for it shall be on the day you go out and cross the brook Jordan, know for certain you will surely die. Now, look, folks, I'm sorry. This is really not a good reading of 1 Kings 2:37. And that is the reference, by the way. Notice the difference. In the day you eat, you will surely die. Versus, in the day you cross Jordan, know that you will die. It doesn't say the day you cross Jordan, you will surely die. I'm sorry, folks. An appeal to 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 37 is an abuse of the language. In the day you eat, you will surely die, versus, you got to know this. Know this, on the day you cross Jordan, you will die. It's not saying, the language does not say, listen to it again. It shall be on the day you go out and cross Jordan, know that you will die. The death is not delineated as that day. Not at all. So the attempt to avoid the language used by Steve is not proper. Number two, he says the phrase, you shall surely die, is literally, in the Hebrew, dying, you shall die. And boy, you got to catch the power of what he's about to say. Adam was not innately immortal. Nobody is other than God, though he could potentially have enjoyed the divine gift of immortality had he retained access to the tree of life. And then he says, mortal creatures are always in the process of dying. This process need not result in immediate death, however, not even eventual death, so long as one has access to the tree of life. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, he just gave away the farm. This is an admission that Adam was created out of the dust. He was created mortal, subject to death. Thus, when God said, in the day that you eat, you will surely die. And like I said, see the article by Dallas Burdett. It'll blow you away. It will answer so much of the objections by Steve Gregg. In the day you eat, you will surely die. The only death under consideration is physical death. When were they supposed to die? That death, that day. The text does not say. And to make it say something else violates what it does say. I'm not arguing from silence here. I'm not arguing from missing words. I am arguing based upon the exact words that are used. In the day that you eat, you will surely die. That does not mean, and it does not say, you will become mortal. Remember, Steve already admits they're mortal. And it does not say, in the day you eat, you will begin to die. To begin to die, Steve has already said, Adam was not innately immortal. Nobody is, though he could have potentially enjoyed. His immortality was contingent on the eating of tree and was thus potential, not inherent. Thank you. Let me reiterate. Yahweh did not say, in the day that you eat, you will begin to die. They began to die the moment they were created. And remember, Steve says the only death of the garden, and you've got to hang on to this, is physical death. So, he points out to us that the original Hebrew means, in dying, you shall die. That suggests they're already in a state of dying. But in dying you shall die. When would they die? Oh, in the day you eat. And again, remember, Steve says there's only one death here. His point number 3 says, God makes a point of God providing animal skins to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness. This appears to have occurred on the very day they sinned. The providing of these skins required the death of an animal slain on their behalf, the first atoning animal sacrifice. It is not difficult to interpret these animals' deaths as the shedding of blood to atone for, i.e., to cover, which is the meaning of atone, the sin and shame of our first parents. This is, in fact, a very common understanding among Christians, and it is legitimate. If sacrifices are made, watch, on behalf of sinners, those animals stand, you got to catch this. Those animals stand in as substitutes for punishment. What is done by a substitute on a person's behalf is counted as if it was done by that person. Clearly, that is what Paul means when he says, we thus judge that if one died for all, then all died. That is, Christ died as our substitute. Thus, in his death, we've all died. The day the substitute died, we died. So also in the substitutionary sacrifice killed on their behalf, Adam and Eve died the very day they sinned. You know, ladies and gentlemen, there cannot be anything more contradictory than these statements. Let's look at the substitutionary death of Christ. Now, Steve says, okay, in the death of the animals, Adam and Eve died. No. What does substitution mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means instead of. In the place of. So Steve changes the meaning of substitution to mean they died when the animal died. Now, did the animal death represent something? Did it symbolize something? Yes, it symbolized substitution. Adam and Eve, in the day you sin, you're going to die. But I'm going to offer the animal sacrifice instead of you dying. Focus in on the meaning of the word substitution that Steve uses over and over here on page 155. Okay. Go to any dictionary, any of them, and look up the word substitution. And you will find it does not mean, well, if somebody dies in your place or as your substitution, that you died with them. It means instead of, in the place of. Let's imagine a man is in prison for killing someone. He has the penalty of capital punishment to be leveled against him. And someone steps forward And let me see here. On pages 50 and following, in chapter 5 and 6, or excuse me, 78 through 90. Okay. In my book, The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ, I have an extended discussion of substitutionary death. And once again, let me emphasize this. Let me overemphasize this, although it's not really possible to overemphasize it. Here's the point. If it is true that the only death of the garden was physical death, okay, that is Steve Gregg's position. And if it is true that Christ's physical death was a substitutionary death to overcome the death of Adam, i.e. physical death, then it must be true that anyone under the power of the substitutionary death of Christ will not experience physical death, i.e. the death of Adam. Back to the illustration. A man is in prison under the sentence for capital murder. He's sentenced to death. His father steps forward, says to the warden, says to the governor, please do not kill my son. I want to offer myself in place of my son. Please execute me, not my son. And the governor says, well, that's, most unusual. We understand your love for your son. And I know this can't happen legally. Okay. But for illustration's sake. But the governor says, okay, we're going to kill you. What happens to the son? He is not executed. That's what substitution means. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Anytime you argue, as Steve Gregg does on page 155, the very top paragraph, in trying to explain away the fact that Adam and Eve did die that day that they sinned, by being alienated from God, by being separated from God, evidently there was only one thing involved in the curse of Adam: physical death. And being cast out of the garden was not in any sense death. Well, that violates the very meaning of death. The Greek word thanatos means separation. The Hebrew words mean the same thing. And so when you say, no, the only death of the garden was physical death, okay, physical death of Adam. Jesus died the death of Adam. But Jesus died as a substitutionary death. Jesus' physical death was therefore substitutionary for those under the power of his death. Therefore, those in the power of the substitutionary physical death of Jesus Christ should never die. Let's see, Jesus said, if a man believe on me, he shall never die. What's that talking about? I mean, if you're never going to die, isn't that not experiencing the death of Adam, i.e. physical death? You see, folks, the emphasis on the physicality of the Adamic death when viewed through the prism of the substitutionary death of Christ is absolutely, it's illogical. And it is prima facie, experientially, empirically false. If any man believes in me, he will never die. Well, what death is Jesus talking about? You can't be talking about the physical death because, there's a 100% death rate from the time Jesus uttered those words until the present time. And yet, Steve Gregg says the only death of the garden, the only Adamic death, was physical death. Okay. What kind of death was Jesus talking about in John chapter 11, 25 and 26? He will never die. Was Jesus introducing a different death here from the Adamic death? Listen, these are just a few of the massive problems that are created when a person says the only death that Adam introduced into the world was physical death. When viewed through the prism of Christ's substitutionary death, which is precisely what Steve Gregg does in this book, again, page 155. He equates the physical death of Jesus with the physical death of the animals, although, of course, he obviously feels like it's far superior. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Go back to Adam. Okay, God killed those animals that day so that Adam and Eve wouldn't have to die that day. Why didn't further animal sacrifices prevent Adam and Eve from dying at all? I mean, after all, the physical animal sacrifices in the garden prevented them from dying that day. Why wouldn't continual animal sacrifices prevent them from dying from then on? Wouldn't that mean they would live forever, as long as they kept offering the animal sacrifices? Back to the point. Let me reiterate this. If it is true that the physical death of Adam is the only death of the garden, if it is true that Christ came and died to redeem man from the death of the garden, from the Adamic death, then it must be true that Christ died to redeem man from physical death. Okay, Steve would say, well, yeah, I agree with that. Oh, but wait a minute. If it is true that physical death is the Adamic death, and if it's true that Christ died a substitutionary death for all of those who believe in him and who accept him, then it must be true that those who believe and trust in Jesus Christ will never suffer the Adamic death, i.e., they will never die physically. Listen, let's be blunt. You and I are going to die physically. No matter how much we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, no matter how much we believe in the power of his resurrection, no matter how much we put our trust in him, we are going to die physically. And that means that we must confront the issue. What did Jesus mean when he said, if a man believes on me, he will never die? Number one, if he was talking about physical death, then obviously that's a promise that failed utterly, totally. How are you going to deal with that? As far as I'm concerned, that's unavoidable. Okay, I'm out of time for today. Go to my website, get a copy of the book, go to the store, and order a copy of The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. If you'll send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube, I'll refund your shipping. That'll save you $5. I appreciate you being with me, and don't forget, tomorrow, Lord willing, Mike Sullivan and I will continue our examination of Doug Wilson's attack against covenant eschatology and his appeal to Hebrews 1 and Psalms 102 and Romans chapter 8 to prove there's a yet future end of time. There is a yet future recreation of physical creation. You don't want to miss it, so I'll see you there.